Welcome to Four Quarter Lives, where we explore our new demographic era and the bold thinkers shaping our longer, multi-stage lives. I'm Avivah Wittenberg-Cox, and today we dive into the power of storytelling, legacy, and memoir writing with James Hagerty, longtime journalist and obituary writer for the Wall Street Journal. After a 40-year career covering business and markets across New York, London, Hong Kong, and Paris, James found an unexpected calling: writing obituaries that capture the richness and downsides of lives well lived. Through more than 1,000 obituaries, he's uncovered what gets remembered, what gets lost, and why we should all take the time to write our own life stories. In this conversation, we explore the power of memoir writing, not just for those who come after us, but for ourselves too. Why do so many of us wait too long to reflect on our own journeys? How can writing our own stories help us make sense of the choices we made and even shape our futures and next chapters? And how does storytelling preserve both personal and collective history? James's book, Yours Truly, makes the case for taking our own narratives into our hands before others try to summarize them for us. If you've ever wondered whether your story is worth telling, this episode is for you. So welcome, James Hagerty, to Four Quarter Lives. Thanks so much for being with me.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
Now, James, you've had an interesting and varied career. You started as a journalist, and you landed somehow in your 60s as a specialized obituary writer. Give us a little bit of the path you took and how you ended up here.
Okay. Well, my parents were both journalists, and so it's not a huge surprise that I became a journalist. Through some flukes, I ended up working for the Wall Street Journal as a young man, my early 20s, and I stayed with them for more than 40 years, and I'm still writing for them in my so-called retirement. And most of my career, I was moving around the world. I was in New York, Hong Kong, London, Paris, Brussels, and I was writing about business, markets, things of that nature. And as a young man, I would never have dreamed of wanting to write obituaries because I thought obituaries were just these boring little notes.
A little sad, yeah. Little sad, little death.
Right, yeah. It didn't seem like a serious occupation. But when I lived in London, I began to notice that I was reading obituaries about people I'd never heard of and enjoying them. And this was because the London papers were good at writing obituaries that really told a story about an interesting person. And there was gossip and humor. They were fun and interesting to read. And that gave me the idea, hey, that would be kind of a fun job. And so when the Wall Street Journal finally decided about 9 years ago that they wanted to have a full-time obituary writer, I applied for the job.
So they decided you weren't pushing this idea on them as a sort of British import that they might want to think of.
I had pushed it about 10 years earlier and been told that it wasn't a priority, but new editor, new ideas.
Yeah, so a shift from, seeing this as a rote exercise with dry facts to actually kind of a mini biography celebrating a life was the shift.
Not necessarily celebrating, but telling the real story.
Yep.
In a respectful way, but not seeing it as a tribute,
okay,
as many people do.
Yep, absolutely. Okay. So
as I always tell people, your obituary is not a nomination for sainthood.
Which might make them hesitate to call on you. So tell us a little bit. You say you've retired, but you did this before you retired, and now you keep doing it. Can you share your age and how much longer you think you might be doing this?
I'm 68. Almost 2 years ago, I retired in quotes, but I didn't retire because the next morning I was working on an obituary. And I've stayed very busy as ever, writing obituaries for the Wall Street Journal and other organizations, clients. And I love doing it, so I will continue indefinitely, not probably forever.
Yeah, it's extraordinary to have a 40-plus year career with a single employer. I mean, those are rare stories these days. So I don't know who your obituary writer will be, but it simplifies the tale a bit.
That will be me. That's part of my message is, it's up to you to do it. Unless you are famous. I'm not famous.
Which is a good link to the book that you wrote based on, now I think you've done more than 800 obituaries, and you've written a book.
Over 1,000, I think.
Over 1,000 and counting. And you wrote a book called Yours Truly, where you argue for the benefits of not only memoir writing, but taking one's own stories into one's own hand. Can you share a bit? What got you started on that?
Sure. When I started writing obituaries, I found I was often talking to the adult children of somebody who had just died. And I was really struck by how much these people wanted their parents' stories to be preserved, but by how little they actually knew about those stories. They couldn't answer a lot of very basic questions, particularly about why and how their parent had done something. So I started just telling people, hey, you should write down something about yourself, because you don't want to leave it to friends and family, because for all of their good intentions, they're almost certain to make a hash of it. It's likely to be dull and inaccurate.
What's the hash they most classically make?
They make you sound dull. They make you sound like a cliche. They make you sound like a saint sometimes.
Yes, exactly.
Which can be pretty boring. And they just get a lot of things wrong. I mean, your parents tell you stories. They're interesting stories, but you're not taking notes on them.
Yeah.
And you don't, a half-remembered story is really pretty worthless. The real firsthand story is often fascinating.
And probably it's a question of what age you are when you actually start being interested in the stories your parents were trying to share at various moments of their lives, and how receptive you were to actually being curious about them.
That's right. I think as we get older, we get more interested in that, but often we leave it until it's too late.
Yeah.
When my father died, we wrote an obituary about him that was accurate, but it was really dull. It didn't give any inkling of his personality. And later when I thought about it, I realized I criticized other people for not knowing about their parents, but I don't even know why my dad decided to become a journalist. I have no idea, even though that's something that really interests me.
And impacted your own choices.
Exactly. So now I would like to go back and ask him, but it's too late.
It's fascinating to me how much in the work I do on midlife transitions, people revisiting what they want to do with the second half of their lives, how rare it is for people to take the time to go back and think about first family influences, why they chose the careers they did. A lot of their early life stories, do you find that also in the kind of people you've been working with?
Yes. I mean, I think the biggest flaw for me with the typical obituary is that it says very little about people's early lives.
Yeah.
And I'm talking about whether it's an obituary, a big obituary of a famous person in the New York Times or Wall Street Journal, or something written by the family. They often just skip over the early days in a sentence or two. And they tell you what happened, but they don't tell you why it happened or how it happened. And that to me is the most interesting. How did you get on a certain path?
Yeah.
And why? And what did you think of that then?
So right back to the beginning and explore all those early influences and forks in the road.
Exactly.
Yeah, no, it's true. And I think people never really think that that's worth the sharing, that those are sort of the really private early days before you actually became somebody.
Yeah. I think with our parents, we just sort of take for granted, oh, they're this, or they're that. We just don't think about it. But when you do think about it, it is interesting. And usually there is an interesting story behind why somebody chose a certain path. There's usually some coincidence that happened, sometimes something dramatic or funny. So it's always worth exploring that.
So you've written this book, Yours Truly, encouraging people to take this memoir writing into their own hands and write their own stories before it's too late. I don't know what age that might be.
The earlier you start thinking about it, the better. I like to think you start by asking 3 questions. What am I trying to do with my life? Why? And how is that working out? Those would be good questions to ask when you're 20, when you're 30, when you're 40, anytime. Because if you can't think of why you're trying to do something, and if it's not working out well, that's a motivation for you to try to improve your narrative by finding something better. You can also at these ages you think, if I died tomorrow, what could people say about me? And if you can't think of anything positive, or not much positive, well, that's also a motivation for you to make some changes in your life. It's also good just to, when you're going through life, write down some things, some interesting things that happen to you, because you're going to be interested in them later on, and other people will also be interested in them. In the old days, people used to write letters, and so a lot of things were preserved that way. My mom said I used to write home once a week because my mother said that that's what civilized people do. I did that for 40 years or more, and my mom kept all those letters. That's a precious resource for me now. Today, people don't write many letters, but sometimes you write a text or an email or a social media posting that got some kind of interesting in it. You could save that, and you could just try to write down some things that you want to remember,
So
whether it's because they're really important or maybe they're just fun and interesting
yeah,
or strange.
and some people actually are fairly disciplined journalers and will take notes throughout, but I would imagine that's a tiny minority of people.
Yeah. Most people are not going to do it on a really regular basis, but it doesn't hurt to keep that in mind and find some occasions when you do want to jot down some notes or record something.
What are the objections and obstacles that people bring up when you tell them this? You've been preaching this since the publication of the book, I'm sure.
Yeah, well before that, yeah. One of them is, I'm not famous, so who will care? Well, you don't know exactly who will care, but maybe your children, grandchildren, people yet unborn, friends, other relatives, people you've never met. Anne Frank was not famous. Samuel Pepys was not famous. But if they hadn't thought of that it was worthwhile to write down a bit about their lives, think of how much we would have lost.
Is the motivation intrinsic, extrinsic, or sort of intergenerational? Is it some people just love figuring out their own lives through the written word, or are they really trying to kind of give a gift or a trace to the future generations?
Yeah, I think it can be both. Some people seem to be just totally uninterested in the past, including their own. And for those people,
or their futures, their past or their future self.
They're interested in the future, something in the present, but some people just don't like to look back. And for them, okay, I say that's fine. Think about it, but if you don't want to do it, don't do it. I think a lot of people are at least somewhat interested in the past and do think about, why did this happen to me? And for them, part of the motivation might be just to sort of straighten things out in their mind. How have I got where I am? What were the mistakes I made? What have I learned? Am I happy with the path I'm on? There have been psychological studies showing that people feel better after thinking about and writing about their past, to sort of come to peace with things and maybe shed a few of their resentments. And the other motivation you mentioned is, yes, you would like, most of us, I think, would like to be remembered somehow. And why not be remembered what we were rather than, some cliche?
Well, and really to control the narrative of who you actually were, as opposed to what other people thought you were. So, the message you're really trying to say is this doesn't have to be for broad publication. It doesn't have to be edited into a large book, but it can be a very precious gift to a very small group of people.
Right. You just don't know. I suggest that people do two things. They write something short that could serve as what we call an obituary, but something just put in a newspaper or on a website. That would be a great service to your family, because it's going to be difficult for them to pull everything together, get it right. And this way you'll have something accurate. But then I think, if possible, you should also go beyond that and write more for friends, family, anybody who may care. Now, you asked about, well, why don't people do this? Other reasons are they just don't know where to begin. Where to begin? There's so much that's happened. And I say, well, just begin with something you find interesting and you'd like to think about and explore. Could be from any period of your life. And then build on that from there. When you remember one thing, it often brings to mind other things. Don't worry about what order things are in. Don't worry about literary style. Don't worry about whether the words are spelled right or the grammar is all correct. Just get something down. You probably never finish the project, but whatever you can get done will be useful. Other people say, I just hate writing. I don't want to do that. But then in that case, you can record. You can record your voice. And I think finally, A lot of people intend to do it, but they just never get around to it until it's too late. So I think the answer for that is just set aside half hour or an hour once a week for a period and do it in small chunks. Get as much done as you can. It's not a good idea to sit down and say, over the next 2 days, I'm going to write my whole life story, because you'll get sick of it.
So start early, and start modestly. Start as young as you can and write in sort of regular, small, digestible weekly bits.
Right. Because otherwise you'll start really strong with lots of detail, and then towards the end you'll be skipping over whole decades with a sentence.
What are the ingredients of structure or secrets of a really successful memoir?
I think structure doesn't really matter. If for some reason you're going to try to publish it, you can worry about that later. It should be in your own voice. Don't try to put it in somebody else's literary voice. It should explain how and why things happen, not just what happened. It should include humor whenever possible. It should include your quirks, how you're different from people, and strange, weird things that have happened to you, things that people don't understand about you or misunderstand about you. You should include the dramatic things that happened to you, but also give a sense of what your day-to-day life was.
That sounds like a recipe. Now, I imagine that you've done your own, of course, life story in the process of preaching this. I think you've got some 55,000 words at last count.
Yes.
You've helped a lot of people do this. So how has this act of writing your own memoir impacted you? And what have you learned from it, taken from it?
Well, I've learned that it's difficult. I'm still not done. I've got to finish. I've only got myself up to about age 50, and I've written way too much. So at some point, I need to edit it down. But I'm glad I've got to start on it.
You've done the first half.
Yeah, perhaps. I've learned that there's some things you go back and you try to explain, particularly about things you wish you hadn't done, and it's kind of hard to explain those in a way that will make sense to my kids or my grandchildren or anybody. It's an interesting challenge. I feel that it's something worth accomplishing. Help me understand myself a little bit better. And above all, when I wrote a draft of what could be my brief obituary, put on some website, I read over it and I realized, it sounds like this guy had a great time, really indulged himself. He did a little bit of volunteer work. That was good. But, maybe there could be more things that he did to help other people. So that's a motivation for me and the rest of my life to try to do more things that I could be proud of in terms of helping other people.
Very interesting. So a recognition of a great story, but some opportunity to round it out with a little bit more balanced contributions.
Exactly.
So I'm curious, is your memoir becoming kind of a living document or dialogue? Does your wife's vision of your life align with yours? Is she writing her own kind of parallel version? And have you shown your draft to your children, and do they agree, or has it opened up their eyes to an entirely different man?
I haven't deliberately shared it so far, but my son did at one point ask to look at it, and I think he raced through parts of it, and we had a brief discussion about it. I thought he totally misunderstood.
How old is he? Maybe he's not yet. He's not old enough, maybe.
He was still a teenager at that point, I think. My wife read my book. She hasn't read my entire life story, but I did show her the other day some parts that involved her life and her family. She found several things to correct. I wasn't totally wrong, but I was a little bit off base. And I think that's an important point. When you're writing about your relationships with other people, if possible, it's great to show those to those people and say, how did you remember this?
Yep.
You'll probably be surprised. You'll probably find some things you'd like to revise a bit. And even if you can't show it to the people you're writing about, maybe they're dead or otherwise out of reach, it's a good idea to show it to a friend or anybody else who could read through it and say, hey, I like this part. I didn't really understand this part. Could you explain that better? And this part was really dull. And that would help you improve it. Just reading it back yourself, I think you'll see places where, hey, this doesn't sound good. It sounds like I'm bragging. It's too sketchy. It's too hard to follow.
So a little bit of editing help from people who would be able to know the accuracy or impact of the tale itself.
Right. Or we can just tell you what they understand from it and what they don't understand. And so it's hard for us to know that often. We know things so well that we don't realize what parts other people wouldn't get. They don't have the right background.
So there's a whole section of the book where you help people learn how to interview somebody else to write their memoir or get them started on their memoir. Now, you've done a lot of this. Can you give us some ideas? I imagine the biggest demand is from children who might want to capture their parents' stories in their older ages. Is that the most common scenario?
Yeah, this is a very important point because in a lot of families, at some point, the children sit down with somebody from their parents' generation and they say, okay, we've got a tape recorder here. We're going to ask you a few questions and record those. And won't that be a wonderful thing for your grandchildren? And everybody loves it. The problem is most people are not trained to interview. So their approach is they ask a question, they listen to the answer, it's recorded, and then they just go on to the next question. The problem with that is when you ask people a question, they usually don't answer it, or they don't answer it fully. They'll probably wander off and talk about other things. And you should let them wander because often they'll wander into things that you hadn't thought of and that are fascinating. But then you have to bring them back to the original question and say, but what about this? And, if you ask them, what did your dad do for a living? And the answer is, well, he was in sales. Well, you say, well, sales of what? And you get more details. And so it's something that can give people a real picture in their head. The other problem is people often record these things, but they are on some kind of technology which is obsolete 10 years later, or nobody can find the recording. So I think it's very important to make a transcript on paper. That way, you can go through it, read it, and correct it, find out where the gaps are, and fill those in. And be thinking about not just you, but somebody 50 years from now. What are they going to need explained? You know who Ralph was, and you know what it means to say when we were at the lake. But 50 years from now, they won't know who was Ralph or what was the lake. So you think about that and you improve this text. And then you have this precious text. You make sure you don't lose it. You keep it in a safe place. You give it to other family members and friends and say, please take care of this. And then you try to keep updating it whenever possible.
That sounds like quite an exercise. Are people starting to self-publish these a little bit in some kind of book form and give them as gifts as this?
Yeah, frequently, yeah. I mean, there are so many businesses out there that have been set up to encourage this in various ways. And it produces a certain amount of text, pictures, and then a book can be created. I think that's a great idea because a book is much more likely to be preserved than some piece of paper that might just get shuffled into the garbage. And you can do this cheaply or you could do it lavishly. People do it both ways. It doesn't really matter. I think putting pictures in is a great idea. It will make it more accessible and interesting.
And I imagine now with, this kind of recording device with all kinds of tech support, we should probably, and I imagine you're contributing it, get a flurry of new life stories that in the past just disappeared. More and more people, I imagine, are going to actually write their own stories in some way, shape, or form.
I think probably more people are because there are a lot of businesses out there pushing this idea and other people pushing the idea, not necessarily for a profit motive. I hope it will mean more are preserved. If it's left to digital only, I'm not sure about that. I think it's best to have digital and paper.
Yep.
Paper, of course, is not going to last forever. It can last a very long time.
And it can be multiplied out because I imagine that most people are going to want to gift this to more than one person.
Right.
So you can get...
Another reason people think of for not doing it is they think, people will think I'm conceited if I'm sitting around writing my story and focused on myself. But it's not. For one thing, it's not just about you. It's also your family's story. It's part of your family history. For another thing, your story is quite possibly the best gift you will ever give to your family and friends, and is a gift that only you can give.
Yeah.
And if you don't give it, it's gone.
I think that's such an important message. The best gift you could ever give your family is your own story. That's very powerful, and I think not enough heard. And people are much more self-effacing. They don't want to. A lot of older people are not listened to necessarily very respectfully. And the concern about, blowing your own horn, I think you emphasize a lot that you're not just writing to become a saint, as you say, or just the high points. It's really to dig into the examined life, the highs, the lows, the whys that will gift not just your memoir, but also a much better understanding of the human and the journey that they navigated.
Yeah, there are a lot of lessons you can learn from people's lives. So if you think about your life, you've learned some things that you'd like your children to understand, and it may help them. And it will certainly help you just to think them through.
Absolutely. What's the oldest person that you have seen write their memoirs?
I'm not sure. Families frequently ask me for help, and often at this point, their parent is above 90 and not in good health. So I don't think it's a good idea to wait until you're 90 or 100. Although for some people could do it very well at that age. But you can't count on that you will feel good enough to do it and you'll be able to do it. I'm sure there are people who've written memoirs in their 90s, but I think it's better to start earlier and build on it.
Yeah, I often think about this and suggest that it's a really key part of Q4, this fourth quarter of life from 75 to 100, that one of the things is to harvest the journey and the life that's come before. And this is a perfect vehicle for doing it.
Yeah, but you'll be happier if you've kind of started in Q2 and Q3. A little bit of a start.
Good notes. So my last question is really about your own kind of journey and your own kind of backstory. Your mother was also a journalist. Your parents were both journalists, mm-hmm. Is that right? And yes. Your mother worked on writing well into her 90s, if we're talking mm-hmm. about the 90s. Are you going to do the same? Are you going to branch out? What's your story going to look like? Are you going to be the 70-year writer?
I'd like to think that I will sort of taper off without ever completely giving up writing. I do think it's important to have a plan for what else I can do, because so much of my identity is wrapped up in being a writer. And 20 or 30 years from now, I may not be able to do that in any effective way. And so I need other things I can do. And part of my plan is to do more volunteer work and just learn new things, develop new hobbies. And I think I'll probably have to just sort of taper off gradually because I'm really a workaholic. But I'm aware of the risks of trying to go on too long when you can't do it as well as you used to do.
Yeah, very interesting. Because obviously your key skill is to do the thing of writing and thinking and reflecting. But if you do only that for a lifetime, you won't have the fully developed experiences you'd like to be able to continue right till the end.
Yeah.
Interesting. Very interesting. So, James, I want to thank you for accompanying us through this memoir writing exercise. I'm struck that one of the programs at Stanford from their Distinguished Career Institute, which is kind of their later life program, they share your passion for memoir writing, because that's part of the entire year program, is to digest your life in order to be able to plan for its next chapter.
Yeah, that's a good idea. I've been teaching adult continuing education courses in how to tell your own story. And I find that people really enjoy those courses. It helps to continue with it for a while because you get people fired up, but then you need to keep on encouraging them and helping them through the process. So I think it's a good area for adult education.
Yep. Absolutely. I think it's a good education for almost any of our listeners. So I encourage all of you to read James Hagerty's book, Yours Truly. The link will be in the show notes. And James, I haven't gotten onto this task yet, and I'm not much younger than you, so I better get kicking, which I will.
Definitely.
Thanks so much for being with me.
Okay, thank you.
For more thinking about the impact of our 4-quarter lives, you can read my column at Forbes and subscribe to my Elderberries newsletter on Substack. Let's design lives that aren't just longer, but better.